Following is a rebroadcast of a Wavemakers show that originally aired on June 11th. We will not be taking phone calls.
Support for Wavemakers comes from listeners like you and the Tampa Bay Times. The Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper is available around the Tampa Bay area and online at tampabay.com. Thanks to the Tampa Bay Times for their support.
Good morning and welcome to Wavemakers with Janet and Tom, a weekly conversation with people making a difference in the Tampa Bay region. I'm Janet.
And I'm Tom. Today we're talking about justice, what real justice means, and how one man survived 37 years of the worst kind of injustice without being consumed by anger and bitterness. Robert Dubois is 59. He grew up in Tampa, but he spent most of his life in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Some of those 37 years were spent on death row, where he was sent by a judge who ignored a jury's recommendation for mercy. Welcome to Wavemakers, Robert.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Dubois is in the studio today with reporters Christopher Spada and Dan Sullivan, who chronicled Robert's journey in a lengthy 4-part series for the Tampa Bay Times, which concludes in print tomorrow. It's available now online at tampabay.com. Welcome to Wavemakers, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks. Robert's here today because after years of writing letters pleading for someone to look at his case, someone finally did. He was exonerated 4 years ago. Last year, the government finally compensated him for the injustice that it has perpetrated. The judge who finally freed him said he had an uncommon capacity for grace and forgiveness.
We'll be talking later in the hour to Dan and Chris, the reporters who chronicled his story. But first, let's talk a little bit with Robert about his experience. You were arrested for the rape and murder of Barbara Graham, who was 19 when she was killed walking home from the Tampa Bay Center Mall. You didn't know her. You didn't know anything about the crime. What did you think? What was going through your mind when you first realized that the cops were trying to pin this on you?
I mean, I was 18 years old, so I had no idea that I needed an attorney because I had done nothing wrong. So what started out as this ended up in just a terrible nightmare.
So you were tell us about when you were first approached, when the first time you saw them and they were taking you away. What was that? What was going through your head? I have no idea what this is about.
Exactly. So the first time they didn't arrest me, they told me that my mother was down at the police station and something was wrong.
Okay.
So I went down to the police station and of course my mother wasn't there. So they said Detective Saladino will be here shortly. He'll explain. So during the hour or so wait, another detective looked at me. He started talking about fishing, and then he says, "Why did you do it?" I said, "Why did I do what?" He says, "Why did you kill her?" And I'm like, "What?" And so when I got upset, he quit talking about it and started talking about other stuff again. And I said, I don't know what's going on here. But I still had no idea that I was going to end up in jail.
And to make it clear, you didn't have a lengthy prior record or anything. You had one little for siphoning gas. It was something very, very small kind of thing.
Right.
So, and you ended up being targeted just because somebody said you hung out with some kids in the general vicinity who sometimes got into trouble. That's what I gathered from reading the story.
Right. That's their excuse, yes.
That was their excuse, but there was no DNA, there were no fingerprints, there were no eyewitnesses. There was just a little bit of random chatter from somebody.
Right. So there was a tremendous amount of evidence in FDLE, and there was a fingerprint on the murder weapon, which they knew all of it did not match me.
But none of it matched you.
Right.
Correct. And you passed a polygraph.
3 times.
Passed a polygraph 3 times.
And you kept talking to them without a lawyer?
Yeah, so I did everything I could think to do to prove my innocence. And yet they continued with this conspiracy to work with a jailhouse snitch and a forensic odontologist who says a bite mark matched, even though the expert witness I had said if it was a bite mark, that whoever did it had at least 2 teeth missing in their upper left-hand side, which is 5 millimeters. I think he said the size of 5 nickels, and I had none missing.
And I don't want to give it all away for you who haven't read the story. I encourage you to read it. It's a really very well done piece all along the way. But we just ultimately, the bite marks were something that was a key piece of evidence, which later on, years later, determined that even the gentleman who testified that those were a match later said he would not have said the same thing today.
Right.
And you were 18 years old.
Right, 10 days before my 19th birthday.
And you were working, where were you working?
At Noel's Auto Upholstery in Town and Country.
And so how many times did they end up interviewing you before they actually arrested you?
No, so they never interviewed me at all.
Well, you went down because they duped you into coming down. Yeah.
Right, but the very first incident was when he asked me to come downtown on a Saturday morning and bite into a piece of soft beeswax. So, I mean, I didn't care. I didn't do anything wrong. So I bit into it, and that was that.
Which, again, later on determined that the techniques that they used to do that match were flawed.
Correct.
So, yeah. And so you ultimately, you spent a good amount of time on death row and then ended up being... that sentence was reduced so that you had life in prison.
And how did that happen? I want to make sure that's clear, because one of the things about death row is that you get a lawyer, and
that's right.
So there's an advantage to being on death row, which is hard to believe I just said that, but...
So when they came to my cell, I had a counselor from the prison come to my cell, and he says, hey, I got some good news for you. They've overturned your death sentence to life. I said, that's not good news to me. I said, he's like, what? He says, you're the only person I ever seen that wasn't happy about this. And I said, the problem is I asked my attorney, who was a public defender, to fight the conviction, and instead he fought the sentencing because he considered that an easier avenue, but I was trying to prove my innocence.
And I would go back for a minute to how your conviction. The judge was Harry Lee Coe,
correct,
who was known for his very harsh sentences. A couple examples that are documented in the story, that he gave 99 years to a teenager who stole $14 and life to a man who was $41 behind on his probation payments. So
that's why it was called Hanging Harry.
It's called Hanging Harry. Mark Ober was the prosecutor, a name well known. He was a longtime prosecutor, state attorney, later became the state attorney in Florida, in Hillsborough County. And the jury did not recommend death, but Mark Ober asked the judge to overturn that decision by the jury and recommend death. And that's how you ended up on death row.
Correct.
So just to show that these were the players that were there, and this was the environment that Mr. Dubois was in as a young 18-year-old kid who, with working hard and helping his family to pay the bills. From what I could tell from the story, you were very highly responsible. So you spent all this time, and then you started writing letters. You started writing letters day after day, year after year. Who were you writing to? Tell me who you were writing to try to hear your story.
Everyone I could get an address for. I wrote to 2020, 60 Minutes, 48 Hours, Tampa Bay Times, St. Pete Times, smaller newspapers, judges. I just wrote to everyone I could get an address for,
And you wrote to Project Innocence.
Correct.
That has been that's what they do, is that they investigate these folks who have been wrongfully incarcerated.
Right. So the first Innocence Project working on my case, which was for years, was the Innocence Project of Florida. So I did not understand until I got out why they couldn't help me. So they ended up sending all of my files to New York, and they went into their archives or in their intake department, and then someone seen them, read them, and says, hey, this has all the earmarks of a wrongful conviction. So,
and what was the problem with they couldn't help you, the Florida Innocence people?
Because the Innocence Project of Florida, just like the one of New York, depend on donations. You know, so if they don't have the resources, they can't fight certain battles. You know, they have to pick and choose. And this one was just too difficult.
And by the time you, how long did you spend on death row then?
Close to 4.
4 years.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, I mean, it was miserable. I was there for something I didn't do. So, I mean, I'm locked in a cell 24 hours a day, with the exception of Monday, Wednesday, and Friday being taken out in handcuffs and walked to a shower for 5 minutes and then return to my cell.
Solitary confinement, basically.
Basically, yes.
And so the fact that you are an innocent man in this horrible condition must have driven you crazy, or did it not?
Well, no, I couldn't let it drive me crazy. You know, that's like people say, oh, if I was in prison for something I didn't do, I'd be kicking and screaming. Okay, and what? What is that going to accomplish? Nothing. I had to try to focus on a way to prove my innocence.
And it sounded like what you also did, which I was interested in. You spent a lot of time working with your dad when you were younger. He was a handyman.
Yes, so my dad was in a wheelchair, so he was paralyzed, but he had much knowledge.
And so when you were in prison, one of the things that you did was fix things. You helped people.
Right.
You gained. Tell us about that. What was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, I literally went from death row down the hallway into this prison and became the electrician.
So just to be clear, you were at Florida State Prison.
Correct.
Outside of Stark, which is where death row is.
Right.
But they also have the larger part of the prison is for general population, and
Right.
that's where you went.
It's considered the worst prison in the state, certainly back then. So there was a lot of violence and death. But the main thing was I could not go to another institution because I came from death row. That's why I literally walked down the hallway into the worst prison. So once I got into population, I started doing the electrical. The first job I did, I went and seen the food service department, and I asked them if I could work on their hot boxes, because the whole time I was on death row, we never had hot food. Mm-hmm. And they always complained it's because the hot boxes didn't work. So slowly I started going there every morning at 4 o'clock before I went to the regular maintenance and working on the hot boxes.
Did you fix them?
Yes, I did.
So your former death row fellow inmates were eating hot food as
Exactly.
a result? But you ate a lot of cheese sandwiches, I read in the
Yes.
Why is that?
I mean, I would start my day in the kitchen at 4 or 5 in the morning, and I would just get a bag lunch with a cheese sandwich and peanut butter sandwich. And I would work all over the compound all day into the night. And then at the end of the day, I would just go back, take a shower, eat a sandwich, give one of them away, and listen to the radio.
You're listening to Wavemakers on WMNF, and our guest today is Robert Dubois, who spent 37 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. And we also have with us Chris Spada and Dan Sullivan, who are Tampa Bay Times reporters who chronicled his journey in a 4-part series in the Tampa Bay Times. If you want to join our conversation, you can call us at 813-239-9663, or you
The
can
show
send
is
us
pre-recorded.
an email to
We are not
DJ
accepting
at
phone calls at this time.
WMNF.org. So it sounds like you never gave up hope. And what was driving you? How did you hold on to that?
My faith, I just knew at some point it would be fine.
Were you always religious, or did that happen when you were in...
No, I've always believed in God. We went to church when I was a child. I've always believed.
And what do you think your life might have been like if you had not spent... You were in prison from 24 until you were 55?
56.
Till you were 56.
No, I was in from 18 to 56.
18 to
Because you
56.
spent time in the county jail
Yes.
awaiting
2
trial.
years.
18 to 56. And I have to say, one of the most interesting illustrations in the Times story shows the change. It's a time lapse of your face showing an 18-year-old boy going to prison and a 56-year-old man coming out later. It's quite incredible. What do you think your life might have been like had that not happened?
Well, I think I would have probably had all my dreams, like a wife and kids, a house, and that's really all I wanted. I didn't want riches or fame.
You just wanted a normal life.
Yeah.
And How much credit do you give to Andrew Warren? Let's talk a little bit about that, about you or Andrew Warren, who was at the time the state attorney when you were released. How much credit do you give him for your release?
I give him and Susan Friedman and Teresa Hall complete credit.
Let's talk about Susan Friedman, ran the
Innocence Project. She was my attorney.
Yep.
So,
and the other
with Andrew Warren, Teresa Hall, and Susan Friedman, in a collaborative effort, they set out to investigate the whole case from beginning to end, and ended up finding the DNA to prove my innocence.
Because Andrew Warren had been elected the state attorney, and then was reelected, so he was on his first term when they started looking into this case, right?
Right.
He created this conviction review unit and started looking at cases, I guess, based on
people claiming their innocence.
People claiming, people like you writing letters, right?
Right.
So he created this conviction review office, and some people questioned, why would the state attorney end up reviewing cases that they had won, right?
Right, and I do want to raise this really important question about that, and maybe, Dan, you can answer this question because you cover criminal justice. You're at the courthouse all the time. It's my understanding there's only maybe 64 of these kinds of units in the thousands of counties that we have in the state. Is that in the country? Is that right?
Yeah, the number I had was it was about 50. It was around 50 in the entire country.
Yeah,
and
so
when
very unusual.
When questioned on that, what Andrew Warren said is that he pointed out that his office handles 15,000 felony prosecutions each year. 15,000. If they get 99.9% right, that means 15 people a year are wrongfully convicted. That's a lot of people that could be imprisoned for something they did not do. So I just want to point that out.
And so one of the key pieces of evidence was DNA.
Correct.
And the DNA was found, because this is many years later.
Yes.
Right? At that point, the evidence had been destroyed by the clerk's office. Is that right?
Yeah,
that's correct.
They didn't find it until the 37th year.
Because is my understanding, in full disclosure, I was working at the clerk's office at the time for the communications department for Pat Frank. And another thing about going off of death row is that they had a policy that once it was no longer a death case, after a certain period of time, that evidence is routinely destroyed.
Well, in a capital case, they're not supposed to, but in 1990, they disposed of every piece of evidence that had my name on it. So when you look at the form, which it took me 26 years to get this form, it shows 3 different places for signatures. It says disposition, method of disposition, and authorization for disposition. So you're supposed to have 3 different offices involved in this disposition, and there were no signatures whatsoever.
And so that lack of evidence, it was tough to then. You are now in the position. It's flipped everything on its head. You now have to prove your innocence as opposed to the government proving your guilt. So where'd they find the DNA, and who came up with that?
So Teresa Hall talked to a detective friend of hers, and he urged her to contact the coroner's office. So the coroner went into his files and found the DNA.
Wow, they had kept it that whole time.
Yes.
And the DNA did not match yours.
That's right.
But it did match someone who was in prison for another crime, another murder.
Before we get to that, let me, though, ask you, how did you find out about that, and what was your reaction?
Well, so they came to the prison and did a DNA swab on me on a Wednesday.
The Innocence Project did that?
Yeah, they sent someone from a lab to do this. So that's in collaboration with Andrew Warren and Teresa Hall. So by Friday night, they had the results. I didn't know that. I just knew I didn't do it anyway, so I knew what it was going to read. So Monday is when I got the phone call, which is uncommon for an inmate to get a phone call. So they pull me out of my cell, take me to a back room, and bring a phone in there. So it's Susan Friedman, Max Galo, Gloria Medina, Sabine Sarwar and Johnsinia Brooks, everyone that worked on my case from the Innocence Project. And she says, okay, so we're all on the phone. She says, Robert, they did the DNA testing. It did not match you. Not only that, they put into CODIS and got a hit on 2 guys.
And what happened after that?
So she told me, she says, you will be free by Thursday. So this is Monday, so I still had to wait till Thursday before they could go before Judge Christopher Nash. And he told them to figure out whatever they got to do for time served to get me out of there immediately, and then we would set up the exoneration hearing.
So you got the news on Monday, and then you actually walked out on a Thursday?
On Thursday afternoon.
And where was the first place you went?
My attorney, my mom, my sister, and some other people from the Innocence Project, we went to Ulele's restaurant.
Excellent.
Good choice.
I want to go to the phones. We've got a call. Mary in Clearwater, you are on the line.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I just want to say this is such an important piece of journalistic endeavor, and I'm so sorry to Mr. Dubois for all he suffered. I remember reading years ago that Hangin' Harry killed himself, and I won't comment further on that. But I want to know, is there anything we as average citizens help Mr. Dubois with his readjustment? And then I'll hang up and hear your answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks for calling.
Anything that people can do to help you? What's your life like now?
No, my life is fine. I go to work every day and go home. That's pretty much it. And look out for my family. But if people want to do something, in my opinion, it's just like when I was asked to speak to 3 classes at Jefferson High School, I told these young people that the most important thing is not to focus on the president right now, but to focus on your local officials, your Congress people, your mayor, your chief police, your sheriff, your district attorney, judges. I said, don't listen to these eloquent speeches they use running for election. Actually, Google. You have all these tools at your disposal. Find out what they've done with their careers.
Well, actually, because the local elections, what you're saying is your local elections are the elections that have the biggest impact on your life.
That's right. These people have an immediate impact on your life.
And you know that very well. So Andrew Warren is running for a re-election against Susie Lopez. What do you think what do you think about what would your life have been like if Susie Lopez had been the state attorney back in 2020?
Since she seems to be on Mark Ober's side, I would say I would probably be dying there.
What do you mean she seems to be on Mark Ober's side?
Well, I mean, she basically has the same mentality he does. Even though they found the 2 people that really did it, she still sticks to her guns like that still doesn't prove he wasn't there. Is that stupid? Yeah.
And the detectives also did not seem to be willing to admit that they made a mistake, right?
Yeah, and what I feel for them? I feel pity. You know why? Because they're living with their own guilt. They can't admit remorse, and I don't think about it.
And you sued them successfully, the detectives,
Correct.
the
Tampa Police Department,
the dentist who came up with this crazy idea that was your bite mark, and you won, and you got millions of dollars now.
Well, the evidence was overwhelming.
Yes.
What they did to me.
Right. And as a result, though, you don't have to be working, but you're working.
Absolutely.
And why?
Well, I love the people at the country club, and it keeps me focused and rooted. I've always worked my whole life, so it's easy for me.
Yeah. What are the things about this story here is the strange twists and turns it takes. Mary already mentioned, our caller, that Harry Lico, he was the judge who sentenced you to death despite the jury's recommendation. He then gets elected as state attorney. He then kills himself as a result of his gambling addiction. Mark Ober is then appointed as the state attorney. I mean,
Yeah, so it seems
bad to worse.
Yeah, for Chris and Daniel, there's so many poetic elements to this. I feel like just what Tom is saying. So you had, first of all, what we find out in the story is that Mr. Dubois actually served time on death row with the two people who actually committed the crime and was aware of one of them because he had killed people in prison. Then you also have that decades after Mark Ober put you in jail and demanded the death sentence against the jury's wishes, he was defeated as state attorney by Andrew Warren, the man who would later oversee your exoneration. And then Andrew Warren literally, while watching the grand jury correct the injustice and indict the two men that he says actually committed the murder, himself experienced an incredible injustice of being removed from office by Governor Ron DeSantis. So, Chris and Dan, how aware were you of that when you were writing the story? Was that something that was coming? I mean, that's what jumped out at me. I thought it was just fascinating. It's like something you can't make it up.
Well, I think one of the things that made me interested in this story. I mean, obviously, I had covered it when Robert was exonerated, and that alone was incredible and an incredible story. But then 2 years later, when Mr. Warren announced the indictments against the alleged real killers, and it happened on the same day he was suspended, it's like it made it all the more interesting. And I think for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of this story, and it's something that we kind of tried to get at in the narrative, is kind of how the city has changed over time and how you have all these sort of almost larger than life figures like Harry Lee Coe, and you have all these very important people in Tampa who are involved in this case. And I think it's a story about kind of how a city changes over time, and that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this to me. I don't know if Chris wants to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the takeaways, I think, one of the things I took away from this is that your state attorney, who is an elected official, really does make a difference. If you speak to people who study wrongful convictions and look at people who have been exonerated, they will tell you that timing is incredibly important, almost as important as what evidence you have that shows that somebody's innocent. And what they mean by timing is who's in office at that moment in time. It sort of changes like the seasons. You have Mark Ober, who was the prosecutor who worked on Robert's case, and he was narrowly defeated by Andrew Warren. And when you speak to him now, he would not have handled Robert's case in the same way that the office under Andrew Warren did.
There would not have been the Conviction Review Committee.
No, and he easily could have still been the state attorney at the time when Robert was petitioning the court, trying to get exonerated. So it just shows you how timing is huge. And then Andrew Warren was removed at a pretty short window of time. And Susie Warren may not have handled this case the same way that Andrew Warren did.
And the other thing about timing that you bring, that's interesting that you bring that up, and it is a really interesting story as well. Like I said, so many layers of how the city of Tampa has changed in 40 years. Part of the timing was that there were a lot of murders going on, and there were unsolved murders, and they were under pressure to solve them. So wasn't that part of the timing as well?
Yeah, I mean, at the time in 1983, violent crime was high in Tampa. There was an increase in murders at that time. And one of the things that Mark Ober said in testimony was that the state attorney's office was, quote, jammed up with homicides at that time. So they were dealing with a lot. And
then in the end, fast forward 40 years later, when they do find the guys that did actually commit the murder that Mr. Dubois was convicted for wrongfully, they solved some unsolved murders, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there was one cold case that they were charged with. That was the murder of Linda Lanson. And because They had the DNA that they were able to test from the morgue. They put it in the CODIS. They started looking at these other cases, and they got a hit on some DNA from this other case, the Lanson case, and they were able to charge these two men with that cold case as well and give that family some closure.
And that was the closure is one of the other reasons that Andrew Warren says why this office is important, that you have people who are, lots of people declare their innocence. And so it's for the families of the victims when they follow up on the cases, and most of the cases they do result in the people affirming the conviction. There's closure for the family, recognizing, yes, this person has been declaring their innocence for decades and decades, but they actually are guilty. We believe they actually are guilty. So that's another reason why having an office like this and doing these reviews is important. We have an email from David Bryant. Let's go to him. I also just want to say I'm sorry to take a break. And this story, again, with all those layers, you all need to turn it into a book and a screenplay because it does have so many elements of it that are so interesting and so well done in terms of reading along. I'm gasping as I'm reading the story and discovering new things along the way.
Appreciate that.
So Dave Bryant says, thank you for bringing this guest on today, and I'm so sorry he had to go through this. I hope the state will compensate him for being wrongfully imprisoned. Yes, he was compensated $1.8 million from the legislature and $14 million, correct, from the city of Tampa, the settlement. Dave wants to know, Robert, have you had trouble adjusting to be free again? It's got to be very emotional and strange feeling to be free after being in prisons for so long, and I've heard it can be a tough adjustment. How is that?
Well, for me, I guess because I was so focused on proving my innocence all the years, when I went into prison, I had to adjust to a world I didn't understand. So when I came back out...
You had never been to a Walmart or a Home Depot, I heard.
Right.
Yeah.
Never.
Or a Target.
Or used an iPhone.
Right, or used a phone, yeah.
You've gotten pretty good at the iPhone, I noticed.
Yes. I can help others now. But yeah, when I came out, it's basically the same thing. 37 years later, I come into a world I don't understand now.
Oh, back to our Dan's point and Chris's point, Tampa had changed a lot.
Of course. I mean, now you have all the high-rise buildings. They weren't there. Home Depot, Walmart, Target, these huge malls that look like cities. And to tell you the truth, when I got out, the way I adjusted is I knew I had to do things. So my first thing when I was driving Susan was driving me to the apartment the first night I was out, the first thing I noticed was that I never remembered such a huge homeless population. So I thought about it for a while, and I said, I really need to do something about this. So I reached out to some people downtown. I was hoping like maybe they would donate a city building and let me renovate it and, give people a place to stay. So then that didn't work out, so I started making bag lunches with granola bars, canned meat that they could just pop off the top, water, all kind of healthy snacks, plus chips and cookies, And I started passing them out to them every time I seen them, and I just continued it.
And you're still doing that?
Yes.
How did you get your first job? How did that work?
So, the first thing I did, it was by word of mouth. I was just doing repairs and renovations around Tampa. And then I would get calls from Orlando and Clearwater and Lakeland, and it's just word of mouth. I never advertised. They would call me to fix an air conditioner or a light or hang some ceiling fans or do a whole complete renovation. And so that was my first job. Then I went to work for U.S. Waters as an electrician, but it was really a far drive, farther than I drive now. So a friend of mine that worked at U.S. Waters, he went to Ardea Country Club as the water manager, and he told me, he says, hey, they haven't had maintenance here. He says, you want to see if you can get a job? I said, well, you can ask them. So I went in, talked to them, and I talked to the accountant, Sandy, and she helped me through the process of filling out the stuff online because I was ignorant to that stuff. And I got the job, and I really loved the people, so I stayed.
We have an email from Liz in Spring Hill, and she says, "Thank you, dear man, for being you, a beacon of hope. I hope all your rights are restored, especially the right to vote. Thank you for being brave enough to weigh in about our elected officials. Your life's work is important to me and us." Let's talk about that. So have you ever voted?
Yes, the first person I voted for was Andrew Warren.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so you registered to vote?
I registered to vote immediately when I got out, within the first week.
That was important to you,
and
obviously.
by November, I voted for Andrew.
Okay, great.
And
that must have felt good.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what did you think when you heard that he had been suspended?
I was at a truck stop. I was driving a semi for that year. So I was at a truck stop, and I walked in because I have to take my 10-hour break. So I got fuel, walked in, took a shower, got something to eat. And then on the TV, I see Andrew Warren. And I heard what happened, and I was just baffled. I'm like, now he's fighting an injustice.
Right, yes.
You know, he just helped me, and now an injustice is happening to him.
So for Chris and Dan, tell us, what was the most, let's start with you, Chris, what was the most surprising thing that you uncovered in your reporting?
Well, I think something that really surprised me about Robert is the amount of grace that he extends to all the people who, you know, you could say were involved with putting him in this situation. You know, he's clear on what he believes people did that was wrong, but he's not personally angry at anyone, and often, you know, will say they were just doing what they thought was right at the time. So that was amazing, getting to see that with Robert. You know, getting to know him more, he's so calm, he's so perceptive, he's a really smart person, which is something that I don't think people knew about him at the time of his trial in 1985. Mm-hmm.
He looks like the kind of guy I hung out with in the 80s.
Really?
Your hair was a little longer than it is now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes in these situations where you're reporting on somebody for a really long time and spending a lot of time with them over a period of weeks and months, like I did with Robert, you get into weird situations where you do form a relationship. It's not a friendship because this is a working relationship, but it becomes something like that. And sometimes people don't understand when they're telling you things that you as a reporter have to question them and verify them and talk to other people about them. And one thing about Robert was when he told me things and I said, well, I'm going to have to go check this out. I'm going to have to find the paperwork that shows this, the police report, whatever it is, interview someone else. He would always say, I understand, you have to go find your own facts. Mm-hmm. And he never pushed back on any of that because what was always important to him was that the true story was told in its entirety.
Well, this was an interesting thing that jumped out at me. It was in 2017 when he was on a parole commission hearing, and his record showed no disciplinary incidents in nearly 2 decades. Okay, 2 decades. And the parole commission wanted him to show remorse, and he says, I'm not going to be remorseful for something I didn't do. And then stayed another 3 years in prison.
Yeah, so basically, the last parole hearing. So at this point, after 25 years, my goal was maybe if I can get parole, I can go out, get a job, find an investigator that will help me prove my innocence. So I went to the 3rd parole hearing, and it was negative each time. So the lady says, so tell me a little about the crime. I said, I know what you're looking for. You're looking for remorse. I said, I can't sit here and tell you I'm remorseful for something I didn't do. She slapped the desk and said, that's it. This meeting's over. And I said, okay, drive safe and have a nice day. So when I walked outside, I'm walking down the prison road. And at this point, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do.
You thought it was going to be another 7 years. You were going to have to wait another 7 years for another hearing.
I wasn't even worried about that. What my thing was, trust me, I did not consider parole board at all at this point. They were not going to let me out.
Even if you admitted it?
They were not going to let me out. Every interview I had was just negative individuals. They were not interested in the truth. And all they wanted was to recommend like 5 years off or whatever. And they didn't even do that for me.
Dan, tell me, what was the most surprising thing that you found in your reporting?
I think one of the things that surprised me was, even after Robert was exonerated and we had this evidence that clearly pointed to people who had never surfaced in the investigation before, there were still some people who refused to admit that Robert was innocent. That was very surprising to me. And I mean, there are cases out there where it's kind of, ambiguous and where there might be some doubt. But to me, you look at Robert's case and it's like, this guy clearly was not the right person. And so that was very surprising to me. You had the DNA, a positive DNA match of someone else, and you had two key witnesses who practically recanted their testimony. The jailhouse informant who said that he was basically given a deal to testify, and the forensic odontist who talked about the fact that he would not have made the same statement had he been asked now.
And to that point, Susie Lopez, the current state attorney appointed by the governor, approached you about this case, right? At the courthouse?
Yeah, she had said some things to me that indicated that, that she had her own doubts about Robert being innocent.
But based on what, though?
I think the idea that some people have is that just because there was DNA from somebody else there, that it doesn't mean that Robert couldn't have been there. But
and I have a question too. That comes up a couple times in the story that this is probably not. It's not true, but that Mr. Dubois' brother and a friend were there. Why were they not ever? Were they never picked up or anything?
I think they were questioned in the original investigation, but there wasn't any physical evidence that they could tie to them, whereas with Robert, they had this bite mark that, the dentist said was his, and so there was that one piece of physical evidence that they could use to tie him to the crime.
And did they later on determine that it might not have been a bite mark at all?
Yeah, there was, at the time of Robert's exoneration, there was another dentist who testified who said that in his opinion he did not believe this was a bite mark. And I actually think that's another one of the interesting aspects about this story is, back when Robert was first accused of this crime, bite mark evidence was kind of like the new thing. It was, this was something that a lot of police were using, and it was considered as good as fingerprints, and people really believed in it, and bite mark evidence was part of what convicted Ted Bundy. And years later, when they looked more, when they gave it more scrutiny and looked at it scientifically, they kind of came to the conclusion that this isn't as reliable as we once thought it was. And by that time, DNA had become a staple of criminal justice, and so I think it's interesting in that respect too.
And that technology changed in the 37 years that Robert was in prison, the DNA, because I seem to recall, Robert, that you read about, you watched a lot of crime shows on TV and news, and you were learning more about DNA, and you kept asking, test the DNA.
Right.
And you couldn't get anybody to do it.
Now, what about the conviction review unit? Is that still functioning in the state attorney's office under Susie Lopez?
Our understanding is that it's still there. There's not currently an attorney assigned to it, and that they've told us that the petitions that come in are being reviewed by a senior attorney there, and that they're in the process of trying to hire someone to run the unit.
Have there been any other exonerations or people freed under Susie Lopez?
Yes, we were told that there were 3. There wasn't any publicity about them. There was a gentleman named Cornelius Marion who was released, but his was a little different because they offered him a modified sentence of time served. His case had to do with eyewitness identification, which is another frequent factor in wrongful convictions.
But there was they didn't issue a press release, they didn't announce it. That's odd. Did you find out why? Are they embarrassed by that work, or?
It's unclear why they don't really
How much of this is prosecutors and police just not willing to admit that they might have made a mistake? You all make mistakes every day in journalism, and you correct them. So how much of this do you think is just they just don't want to admit that they were wrong?
Ego.
Yeah, I mean, there's a human nature that it's uncomfortable to admit when you've made a mistake.
So if you put an innocent man away for 37 years, I'd feel pretty bad about that.
But there's a difference between discomfort and pushing through that and willingness to do the work.
It has echoes of another case in Lakeland, Leo Schofield, which has gotten a lot of national attention because Gilbert King did a whole podcast called Bone Valley, and he has just recently been released, but on parole. It was very similar to your situation. He insists that he's innocent of murdering his wife. New evidence points to someone else. Parole board wouldn't even consider it unless he admitted it. He wouldn't do it. Eventually, they did come around, probably because of the publicity from Bone Valley. So, do you know? Are you familiar with that case? What do you think of that?
No, I have heard of it. So I have not read any details. So I really can't say anything about it.
We got a phone. Let's go to the phones. We've got Jesse on the line. Jesse, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah. Hey. First of all, I just want to thank all of you, and I thank you for having. I can't call his last name, but
Dubois, Mr. Dubois.
Okay. And hey, thank you for having him on this morning, because I'm a victim myself of some of the injustices that can be done by the judicial department. Okay. And so I was listening to you all may remember, I listened to WMF a lot, and I was listening to Sunday Morning Forum. I love to listen to Sunday Morning Forum also. And I was listening to it about, 2 months ago. And they had a good thing on there with the public defender. I can't remember who all was there. But anyway, they had a good one where they was talking about restoring, just redoing the judicial system. And the whole thing need to be redone. And you had public defenders that would admit this. And back to Mr. Dubois, I remember being there in prison too with the guy that was out of Arcadia that was accused of killing his children. This was back in the 60s. He was accused of killing all his children, and only to find out that after he did 11, 12, 13 years, something like so, on death row, a lady came forward and said, no, he didn't do it. I did it. So then they got to let this guy out, and which he did, but his whole head has been turned gray. I can imagine that, being on death row, knowing that you didn't kill your children. But anyway, I thank him, and I thank you all for having him on this morning. I thank you all for listening or looking at the judicial system. I had a case where the police said that I raped a woman. Okay, the woman never said that I raped her. They put me in a police lineup. She came to the police lineup, picked the guy out of jail that had been in jail for 2 or 3 months. And the deal's supposed to be is when you're not picked out of the police lineup, you're supposed to be released. So, I don't know, 2 weeks went by that the guys in the jail with me say, this was in Sarasota County, but the guys in jail with me say, hey, Master, why haven't they let you go? I say, I don't know, man. They say, what's your attorney name? I say, I won't call his name on there, but I give them my attorney's name, and they sound like a chorus. All these guys that knew him sound like a chorus. They say, oh, you got, and I won't call his first name, but they call his first name, and then they say, up the creek, and then they call his last name. And so anyway, I get on the phone with him, and I say, well, hey, what's going on with the police lined up.
Wait, Jesse, I appreciate your call. I want to let's let our guests talk. I want to hear what they have to say. You're bringing up some interesting questions about the criminal justice system, and Tom and I have had on this show guests in the past talking about the criminal justice system. Chris and Dan, start with you, Chris. Is this something you guys are going to keep pursuing as journalists to talk about what's going on with our criminal justice system? There's a lot of going. I know we had Jeff Brandis on the show. I know he's working a lot to try to fix some of the issues that we have. What's your take on all of that?
I'd certainly be interested in pursuing more stories about this. I mean, I would love to hear from people in the community who have tips for us, who have things they want us to look into. We always welcome that and hope for that. So.
I mean, because you hear horror stories. There are always so many horror stories about conditions in prison. I mean, that's the thing that gets me. I mean, it's wrongful convictions are obviously terrible, but
Robert, you experienced that personally.
Conditions are awful.
How awful? How many prisons did you end up staying in?
I believe it was like 5.
Most of the time in Florida State Prison outside Stark?
Yeah, that was 14 years until they finally locked it down completely in 99 and transferred me out.
Are there simple things you think that they ought to be doing to make life better for these convicts?
Well, there's a lot of things they could do to make it better. Food, air.
It's not air.
Oh yeah, air conditions. There's. I mean, so hot. Yeah.
And then the clothing they make them wear. You know, they just take every cheap avenue they can when they're supposed to be taking care of the inmates. So some of these prices you see on how much it costs to keep an inmate, number one, they make their own clothes. The inmates do that, free labor. So all these things they're telling Tallahassee, like looking for all this extra funding for the prisons, whereas a private prison doesn't ask for more money.
Well, they don't care. They're just trying to cut costs. We've had a guest on the show. We've talked about the difficulty that women have getting feminine hygiene products when they're in prison. Dan, what about you? You cover this. What are your thoughts on that? About the criminal justice system and fixes that could be made to make it not so terrible?
Well, this is really most of what I cover is criminal justice related, and I think there is still definitely a movement for reform in the system. And I mean, we could talk all day long about different reforms that could be done. I think, there's issues not just with wrongfully convicted people, but even, people that were found guilty. There's questions about disparities in sentencings. There's racial issues in the system. There's issues of mental illness. There's issues of poverty. And, I think a lot of what we see in the criminal justice system kind of goes back to just poverty and people, not having the means to defend themselves and that sort of thing.
Well, that was certainly the case with you, Robert. And then you said you were only on death row for 4 years. And once you're not on death row, doesn't that change the help that you get in terms of legal support?
As long as you're on death row, they have to give you a public defender, because if you're sentenced to death, they have to have someone fighting for you. But once that death sentence is gone, so is your help. Now you're on your own, which I was on my own on death row anyway, because he was only fighting the sentence.
We don't have much time left, but I did want to ask what you're going to do next time. It's interesting that Andrew Warren has decided to campaign for his old job, running against Susie Lopez, who was appointed to the job. Is this a campaign? Are you interested in politics? One of the profound points that you all made in this series was that politics affects justice.
Well, apparently it does, because a lot of the things that are happening are politically motivated, whereas me, in my heart, I don't look at either side. I think about what I would like to see in that office. Andrew Warren is an honest man. Teresa Hall is an honest woman. They ran the system with integrity and complete transparency. So when they found a wrong, they publicly mentioned it. They didn't suppress it.
And that's when we started talking at the very beginning about the true definition of justice. That, I guess you would think, that's justice.
Yes.
The story is called The Marked Man. It is in the Tampa Bay Times. It's a 4-part series. You can get it online. The last The fourth and final segment of the series is in print tomorrow. I encourage you to take a look at it. It is an incredible read. Thank you so much to the three of you for being here with us today. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.
This is WMNF Tampa.
This is WMNF Tampa and WMNF.org. Stay tuned for NPR News, followed by Wide Awake America with Nadine Smith.